touch this. Can't touch this. Can't touch this. Can't touch this. Bring it down.
Hello and welcome to Hammerheads, episode 14. And I'm Marcus Wilson, and I'm not Miles Watts because he's over here. Hello.
Hello. I'm
Hello.
over here and I'm Miles Watt. How you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. All the better for seeing you. And we are going to be talking tonight about Hammer.
It's the 70s.
We're in the 70s.
We made it.
For better or for worse, we'll find out. And we are ploughing through, in a good, positive way, the BFI's list of great Hammer horror films.
We're trawling through it with gritted teeth and rolling eyes. Oh, God, not another one of these. No, very much not the case, no.
So the BFI published a Hammer horror film for every year. This was basically a list of the great Hammer horror films between 1957 and 74. So we have been perusing those films over the last few months. And we're up to 70. So, all good.
Yeah, and I remember, one of the things I wanted to do, and I still have this, there's a big list on my phone of all the films I should have watched and haven't seen, or need to rewatch, or need to see at the cinema, or need to stream, or need to buy, or whatever. And this was sort of part of that. A couple of years ago, I remember seeing this list, and it said 17 of the one Hammer film for every year of production. They did their peak work, and I thought I should set myself that as homework. I need to at least watch those 17 films and fill in this massive gap. And it's been way more enjoyable than I even thought it would. I thought it'd be right. There'll be some cheese here, but I've learned quite a lot about, the studio, the actors involved, the sort of techniques they use when filmmaking, the sets, the cinematography. It's been a real education, hasn't it? So
you've learned to recognise all of the sound stages of Bray Studios.
Oh yeah.
There was, I think there was some stuff filmed on location.
Oh yes, very, very good location shots in this. In fact, it starts with your classic, doesn't it? I sent you a picture as I was watching it. I went, "Oh, this is familiar."
Yeah.
A horse and cart with with some gentlemen in it driving through a woods. I went, "Here we are again."
There's been a few of those, hasn't there? And the great Roy Kinnear as a travelling salesman, who reminded me a bit of Jolyon Wag in the Tintin books, who is...
oh, yes, he is, yeah. I think his son's a very talented actor as well, Rory Kinnear. He's been in loads of stuff.
Yeah. I hadn't realised that Roy Kinnear died when we were kind of very young in the 1980s, and he was sort of kind of stand-up. Did he do stand-up comedy as well as sort of comedy characters? I don't
know. I remember him from Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Come on, Wonka! Yeah. And bits of telly, and he was in like Roland Rat.
Roland Rat, yeah.
So he was this guy. My dad was a big fan, so he'd be like, "Oh, old Roy Kinnear's in this and this and this," and I was like, "Oh yeah, Roy Kinnear." So when he died, this is sort of late 80s when he died on a Musketeers movie.
Yeah, I just always assumed that he'd, just had a heart attack or something like that. But I was looking it up, saying that he died.
Well, he did have a heart attack after falling off a horse.
After sustaining, that's right. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Anyway, he was only 54 when he died, and I think Rory was probably only like kind of,
10.
10, yeah.
He was 10 years old, yeah.
They do have a look of each other, though, don't they?
They really do. I mean, he could play his dad, but he had this great sort of almost like an Arthur Lowe character. He had this sort of squat, balding, sort of dusty comedy. But he was a great. I knew who he was quite well when he died because we'd seen him on telly and in a few films and stuff. And my dad always had old films on. But right from the start, this film, I was like, when I saw the cast list, I thought, what a great cast list. It's got some of the best comedy and character actors, like gentleman character actors in British cinema.
The cast is the best thing about this film, I think.
I think so. Having said that, I did really enjoy this one, but I think we'll get into that. But the cast first and foremost it draws you in, doesn't it? Because you've got Roy Kinnear, you've got Isla Blair, you've got who comes in later, you've got, and I'm going to forget her name, so I had it on standby. Linda Hayden.
Oh yeah, as Alice.
as Alice, and she is the next year starred in one of my favorite horror films, The Blood on Satan's Claw.
Oh, yes.
In which she plays Angel Drake, who's like the sort of the ringleader, and that's a defining role for Linda Hayden. She always played sort of sexy roles, but in that one she's the sort of real troublemaker, devil possessed, over made up girl with flowers in her hair leading everyone into temptation, and then that's her role. That's her definitive role, I think. But she's very good in this too.
Jeffrey Keane from
yes.
The Bond movies.
Yes, now. See, I sounded like Kenneth Williams, and yes, now. I did a tweet earlier because I had to correct myself. So I said I was watching something with Jeffrey Keane. Which character does Jeffrey Keane play in the Bond movies?
Grey, isn't it?
Oh, you knew? Okay, well, I'll give you that one. Yes, he played Grey or the Minister of Defence, because I did a tweet saying, he played M in the Roger Moore film. I was like, no.
Yeah.
Now, I knew that was Bernard Lee.
Yeah.
And Jeffrey Keane never played M because they went to... I think Jeffrey Keane's all the way to Living Daylights because he was in that as well, but I don't think they had M. And then they brought M back for Goldeneye with Judi Dench. I don't know who played it in License to Kill, but yeah, he was Sir Frederick Grey or the Minister of Defence. You just say Minister, but I remember I sort of backtracked. I remember in Moonraker at the end when they find him canoodling in the spaceship. No, it's in the spaceship. And he says, "My God, what's Bond doing?" And just before that, Bernard Lee's
attempting re-entry.
I think he's attempting re-entry, sir. That's cute, isn't it? And just before that, Bernard Lee as M says, "My God, what's Bond doing?" No, he goes, 007. It's this great mix of Desmond Llewellyn and Bernard Lee and Jeffrey Keane as the trio. I think that might be, the last one Bernard Lee was in as M. But yeah, Jeffrey Keane, what a indelible sort of, you see him and you just think Bond, don't you? You just immediately think Bond.
What a great put upon face he has as well.
Oh my God, yeah, so good. Yeah, he just looks like a long-suffering Englishman, doesn't he? And then who else have we got?
We got Peter Sallis.
Peter Sallis, Wallace himself. And I love that there's a scene early on when they're with all the prostitutes, and he says something like, "Ooh, my grandfather's," or something, doesn't he?
Oh, more cheese, Gromit.
More cheese, more prostitutes, Gromit. They're all the lads, and they put some great Foley over the top of an ADR of the men going, "Oh, hey!" Like you could tell they were sitting there watching it, going, "Oh, I should say something now because my mouth's moving." That really, really made me laugh. I enjoyed that.
Peter Sallis, as well as being the voice of Wallace in the Wallace and Gromit films, he was obviously very well known in the UK for playing in Last of the Summer Wine, a kind of long running comedy set in Yorkshire. And apparently he's buried there. He decided, although he was born in Middlesex, but he's buried next to the actor Bill Owen in Upper Thong near Home Firth, where they filmed Last of the Summer Wine. That's right. Yes, that sounds very familiar. Yeah, he played Clegg. There's Compo, Clegg and Foggy. I mean, we all watched Last of the Summer Wine. And Clegg was just Clegg was the middle one, basically. He just sort of like commented on everything. Foggy was the one that they followed. Is it Brian Wilde? They've just followed him everywhere. Yeah. So it was a great sort of tall man, medium-sized man, small man comedy. Yeah. But to everybody else, Peter Sallis is the voice of Wallace, let's face it. I mean, it's one of the best voices. There was always a runaway bed going down a hill in every episode of Last of the Summer Wine, I think.
It was contractually obliged by the end, yes. They had to put a bed going down the hill. You've also got Ralph Bates. We should talk about Ralph Bates. Ralph Bates, he's a horror actor of some note, and he died very young, but he plays Lord Courtly. Yeah, he was 51 when he died. It was I remember him dying because it was the early 90s, and my dad always said, "Oh, old Ralph Bates has died."
Ralph Bates. What did he do apart from horror? He was in sort of sitcoms as well, wasn't he?
He was in sitcoms. Dear John, you remember Dear John?
Dear John. It was
John.
I seem to remember it being a very unfunny and sort of like one of those 80s comedies in the UK that was all a bit of tragic, like Duty Free,
Yeah.
which was all about broken marriages and things like that.
It was quite sad. I mean, it was well written and well acted and stuff, but it was about a guy, yeah, and the opening music was about how it was a letter from his wife, a Dear John letter, and
Yeah.
she left him. So it was about a guy who'd just been left by his wife. So yeah, the premise was a bit sad.
Yeah.
But I'm just looking at his IMDb now. He was in loads of stuff like telly stuff like Cold Dark, Tales of the Unexpected, Crown Court, just loads of like solid British telly. But he did star in a couple of horror films. Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde.
Oh, yeah.
It's just the year after this one. Lust for a Vampire in same year, 71. The Horror of Frankenstein. He starred as Frankenstein.
Oh, yeah, because he was being lined up as the replacement for Christopher Lee as Dracula, because Christopher Lee was getting less and less impressed by the scripts that were coming out for Dracula. So they'd sort of lined him up to play Dracula in this film, but then the American distributors, I think Warner Brothers, wouldn't support financially the film without Lee, so Hammer sort of had to go begging to Christopher Lee to take part, and so Ralph Bates gets a sort of slightly smaller role in this film, but does incredibly well, and he's incredibly committed to the role that he plays.
Well, what comes off well is that Courtly comes off as someone who's obsessed with Dracula. When he finds out from Roy Kinnear that he's got the remains of Dracula, he wants to bring him back to life, and then he's the first to come a cropper. Because it's like, oh, you've brought him back thinking, oh, he will be the master. It's like, no, the first thing he does is use you to make himself corporeal again.
Powerful.
So
and he's sort of the master of the dark arts. And I think the name Courtly is probably a nod to sort of Aleister Crowley as well.
Yeah, I think so. I think he's meant to be Aleister Crowley, isn't he?
Yeah.
Like, obsessed with the occult. And but let's talk about Christopher Lee, because the sort of critics of this film said that he kind of turns up and then disappears again. That's really, you don't feel his presence as much. And in some ways, Taste of Blood of Dracula does follow the path of least resistance. It's like Dracula's coming back. He's influencing the local young ladies. They're all acting weird. One by one, he kills people, and they come to him, and then someone kills him at the end. And that's exactly what happens in this film as well, even if it starts with Dracula dying, which is quite a good beginning, actually.
Well, it does. There's this sort of crossover with the previous film from 1968's Dracula Has Risen from the Grave. So they're sort of borrowing footage, I think, from the end of that film for the start of this film. So, Roy Kinnear stumbles over Dracula as he dies with the sort of crucifix through his heart, and obviously then collects the relics, which he then takes back to old London town to sell on. But for me, the whole of the film could almost have been, it was almost like Dracula is cut in, or the Christopher Lee part is cut in from another film. Like every scene seems like it's sort of like just cut in from, it's like the actors kind of walked off set halfway through the film. So they sort of had to cut in kind of stuff from rehearsals or from other films to kind of make it.
It's almost
it has that
like,
feeling about it.
The Trail of the Pink Panther, where they just cut in Peter Sellers.
That's what I thought of, actually.
Yeah, so it looks like Christopher Lee, he turns up, you're like, brilliant, Christopher Lee's here. And then at the end, he does the countdown, the first one, the second one, the third one. And you're aware.
This is where Sesame Street's The Count comes from. It's like, the first.
Is it? Do you think it is?
The second.
I love to count. I would love it if that was true. So it's like they sort of got Christopher Lee back, and he's fine in it. He doesn't get much to do. What he does do is classic Christopher Lee Dracula, isn't it?
His death is probably the least dramatic of all of the Dracula films at the end as well.
He melts away in a spectacular series of slow dissolves, which none of which quite match. You're like, okay, and then we'll mix to this one, and then this one, and then this one. Like now, you could do image stabilizing, and you could make the skull match up and stuff, but it was in a different position. It reminded me actually of like the original werewolf film, where it gradually mixes in the change. When the hands are there, and then which one is that? That's the Universal one, isn't it, from the 30s? That does that. The Wolfman.
That's right.
So it was lovely to see Christopher Lee back, but it did feel like he was almost like the least interesting thing about it, weirdly.
And weirdly, I mean, it didn't even really need to be Dracula, did it? Because the heart of the story, you have this kind of revenge narrative which almost sets children against their fathers. I mean, it's kind of a war between the generations almost, that you have these three very wealthy businessmen, Hargood, Paxton and Secker, who ostensibly are saying to their wives, we're out at last Wednesday of the month. You know that we're out in the West, in the East End, giving to the poor and things like that.
Giving to the whore. Yes, I think...
Wenching Wednesdays.
And I think, much as I love Christopher Lee to ribbons and back, I think it would have been better in this case to have Ralph Bates as the Courtly becomes he inhabits Dracula and becomes the new vampire, and it would have been just a bit more interesting. But it was nice to see Christopher Lee back. But the result was like they've got him back for not really any reason.
Yeah.
And by the end, you're like, well, there he goes again. I actually shouted at the end of the film. I shouted up to Vicky, Dracula's died again. So there were lots of interesting things about it. Like, I think some people have said it's quite a weak film, but I actually think it was pretty solid. Like, I mean, I really enjoyed Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed in the last episode in the same way I enjoyed this, which is like, here we go again.
Yeah.
But it's so well shot and it's so well staged. I think they criticised the director because it's his first movie and it shows. What's the guy's name? I should at least give him a mention.
Isn't it? Sasti?
That rings a bell. Sasti. Yeah, Peter Sasti, who also directed
Hands of the Ripper and Countess Dracula. He did a few things for Hammer.
Oh, he did Adrian Mole as well.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So there you go. That's Peter Sasti. That's probably the most famous and most watched thing he's done that we've watched.
Yeah,
I would say, because I remember us both watching Adrian Mole back in the 80s. But yeah, I thought it was very well made. I didn't think it was weak or boring or.
I had a similar thing to the thing that I had with The Brides of Dracula. That you kind of sit down and watch it for the first time, and you're expecting a certain thing, which is kind of Christopher Lee in a lead role, being a spectacular Dracula. Spectacular.
Count Spectacular.
But then I kind of got something entirely different, and I was pretty disappointed. So I sat down a few days later and watched it again. And actually, the second time I watched it, when I didn't have those expectations, I thought it was a really good film, actually.
Oh, okay.
And it was a bit like the last Frankenstein film that we watched. It was really trying to ramp up the kind of saucy sexiness to kind of 11, wasn't it? Because you could in 1970, because the censor wasn't going to cut things to ribbons as much as they had been doing in the 60s. Yeah, I mean, there was sort of a hint of incest, wasn't there? Yes, exactly. What was the name of the brown-haired lass? I think that is Lucy. And then there's Alice, who's the daughter of Hargood, the main character. Well, she obviously is meant to. Linda Hay was meant to be the sort of the sexy one, but Lucy. There's the whole sort of like eroticness of him biting her on the neck and all of that, or her biting, everyone biting each other, and it does go into. And there's a bit lusty, like with the dancing, you get close-ups of the dancers' breasts, kind of thing. So it's trying to be a bit raunchier than maybe they were allowed, in the early 60s. It kind of, there was like a big trend in the 70s, really, to kind of see how far you could push that. I mean, a few years later, we had like Le Grand Boeuf like the film where it was quite similar in a way that you had these kind of 3 or 4 businessmen, aristocratic types who sort of had this kind of jaded ennui, and they were trying to kind of push perversions to the limit to kind of just get themselves out of this sort of funk that they had. And then there was like Pasolini's Salo, things like that, which was just horrendous. But this came before all of that, and it was similar again in it. There's these kind of like jaded old men who are kind of trying to be upstanding male members, if I can use that phrase, of the community. And just this is what leads them to the Ralph Bates character, obviously, because they're so tired of their wenching and they're looking for sort of a bigger thrill. And they don't seem to really understand what Lord Courtly is suggesting, and as soon as
No.
they do see what he's suggesting and
Yeah.
get to taste the blood of Dracula, they're like, "Oh no, you taste the blood of Dracula! I don't want to taste the blood of Dracula. You taste it.
You taste it. I'd love it if they said that, like in The Simpsons. Sorry, that's my fault. No, that was me. No, that was me again. I don't want to taste the blood of Dracula. You taste the blood of Dracula. I thought it was done very well, where Courtly gets covered in dust and it's a reverse shot. So
Yeah.
they obviously blew all the dust off him and then played the film, ran the film backwards, and it looks like the sort of dust of Dracula is inhabiting Ralph Bates. That was very, very well done. But what this film doesn't do is as well, I think, as Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed, is that had that fantastic ending with Cushing going mad in the mansion, and that great finale where you have Freddie Jones trying to lure him out and making sure that he burns to death, that kind of thing. And that was pretty exciting, like a stepping up of. Whereas this is more like, we're going to get Dracula. We've got Dracula. He's fallen off the thing. But I did like Christopher Lee's reaction to realizing he's in a church, basically, because it reminded me a little bit of the end of Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Yeah,
guys in a church,
It was actually, it did draw more upon the source material than probably some of the more recent Dracula films we've seen from Hammer. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of characters in this as well, and I agree. The end is kind of peters out a bit. You've got, I think it's Paul, isn't it, who gets sent after Alice, thinking that Alice she might not have gone entirely to the dark side, and what does he get told by Secker? I think he's like told, "You read up, Paul, read up, Paul." Then he kind of like you kind of see this montage of him like swatting loads of books and kind of getting his like crucifix together and heading out.
I know. Like, oh, now I know how to defeat the evil. Brilliant.
Yeah. So that just kind of felt as though it was all a bit kind of cobbled together in the last, like the 15, 20 minutes at the end just didn't really do much for me. But the other young people, because it's a film of young people versus their parents. One of the other great actors who we neglected to mention was Martin Jarvis.
I was just going to say Martin Jarvis is in it, yes. And he of this serene voice of so many audiobooks.
That's right. And of all the young people in the film, we don't, I don't know, maybe I blinked and I missed it, but we don't really get to find out what happens to Martin Jarvis in the end of the film. And I feel that I need closure.
Yes, I know. Well, he turned up on the Titanic, obviously, with his wife. And yes. I know what you mean. It's like he was in it, and then it was like, right, he wasn't contracted for the last 20 minutes, so we won't use him again.
Yeah, that's a big shame, because everyone sort of else gets their storyline gets tied up, but not old Martin Jarvis.
Yeah, and it's funny, I think, we've got 3 more movies to go before 74, but we've got 4 more movies. We have 4 more movies, yeah. The Devil Rides Out, after seeing that and just what absolute, speaking of Aleister Crowley, what absolute lunacy it was. It was Dennis Wheatley, wasn't it? Not Aleister Crowley, although it was very Crowley-esque. The ending of that and the setup and the whole sort of the way it's played out, that last act was so sort of thrilling and weird and over the top that anything after that now seems like, come on, you got to at least match that. Whereas, Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed does do that. You got the fire in the house and all that stuff. Whereas this sort of felt like, okay, it's going to have a really interesting ending. And no, it just ends in a church.
The first 2/3 again, kind of interesting, but then peters out.
Yes, it's almost like a best of Hammer. Like you could show this one out of context and go, hey, this is a Dracula film with Christopher Lee. And people would watch it and go, oh, yeah, that's a good one. But they, without seeing Dracula or some of the other ones, and think it was really great. And I do think it's solid and it's solidly made. But yeah, maybe it does suffer from being a first-time director and not being. But again, then it's got one of the best casts, as we just talked about. It's got one of the most interesting casts of great British actors.
Super cast.
So it's got a lot to recommend it, And
Peter Sasti may be a first-time director, but he will be a second-time director when we meet again for The Hands of the Ripper in 1971.
Oh, it's a Ripper one next. That's good, because I know we've got another Frankenstein one with Cushing, and I think that's to round things out. But We've got a fairly loopy one in a couple of episodes, haven't we?
We have a loopy one next because it's
Oh, great.
after Hands of the Ripper, it's Vampire Circus, and that's kind of
Yes.
quite a dreamlike, nightmarish kind of traveling circus vampire.
Oh,
That
nice.
old chestnut.
That old it's been done to death now, hasn't it? The other thing I was going to say is when we were talking about, the way at the beginning of the film they find Dracula, melting away and then resurrecting later on. It just sort of, people are always saying about Hammer that they went downhill after 74, and then you had, your Texas Chainsaw Massacres and all these films that, the slasher films, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street. But this sort of predates that because, again, Dracula, sure, he's an ancient character created by, folklore plus Bram Stoker, but Dracula is kind of like those immortal serial killers that came later.
Well, I guess you could say that this film, Taste the Blood of Dracula, has at least the kind of, hey, daddy-o, teenagers.
Yes, it does.
Teenage angst and teenage, just wanting to get out there and enjoy myself, man.
Yeah, and that's running alongside things like we've already covered, like Plague of Zombies and stuff, but we're doing stuff that's now alongside Night of the Living Dead and some of these great, like Italian and Giallo directors that are coming along in the 70s, and now Hammer people start to take the mick out of it a little bit because there are edgier films coming out now. But Hammer did a lot of groundwork. He laid a lot of groundwork for these later films, and most people would say, "Oh yeah, I love Christopher Lee and Dracula." If they're a horror film director, they at least know that character. So I think, as we go on, and we got 4 more films left, we don't want to sort of play the card too strongly that Hammer was starting to peter out, because they'd had a really good run by that point. They just weren't making the money. That's the problem. Cushing was probably done with it. Christopher Lee was definitely done with it, although he did star in Dracula AD 1972.
Yeah, I know, that's
2 years after this, didn't it?
An interesting one as well. But no wonder they're not making the money. I mean, actors of the caliber of Martin Jarvis, Roy Kinnear.
I know. I wonder how much money they did get paid. Probably like £2,000.
I was going to say £200.
£200 for 6 weeks.
And a bun.
And 4 shillings and tuppence. Yeah. But I enjoyed this one. I thought it was at least as good as Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed. I enjoyed it from start to finish. I thought it looked spectacular. Great sets. Really great locations and very nice cinematography. By this point, we're sort of in love with Hammer and we're like, oh, it's another one. And I can't see any signs of decline at this point, even though this is a retread of previous films.
There's kind of, there's obviously the kind of, now they're getting past the thing, more past the censor. They're kind of shoehorning stuff in that they might not. And I think this is probably Christopher Lee's problem with it as well, that kind of sensationalism and detracting actually from the horror of Dracula, the character himself, that there are these other situations happening that sort of detract from that.
He's more of a seducer, isn't he? I mean, he always was, but it was kind of a surprising, because of his performance in the original Dracula. He was seductive, because he was a big, imposing guy with mesmerizing, his mesmer stare. Maybe they didn't see Dracula as a romantic character until Christopher Lee started playing it, because before it was Nosferatu, and Max Schreck played him as this horrible spiky tooth thing that would come for you in the night, whereas Christopher Lee, a lot of women probably wouldn't mind it if Dracula looked like that, you know what I mean? So maybe Christopher Lee made that role, and then they kept saying to him, can you come back as a seductive Dracula,
well, he sort of comes across as the sort of old-fashioned character in this, because obviously everyone else in the film is so much more debauched than Dracula almost. It's like he's going to have to try and outdo the other characters in the film.
That's true, actually. Of course, they're all sleeping with prostitutes and bashing each other around and stuff. And then Dracula comes along and he's like, "I'm going to bite your neck." It's like, whatever.
Yes. He's the what's the word? Anti-hero? No, I don't know.
He is almost the anti-hero in a way, because you're like, yay, it's Dracula, and these characters are bloody awful and horrible people.
Yeah.
And even though you sort of feel sorry for the daughters,
You're kind of rooting for Dracula very much in this.
You're sort of rooting for Dracula, yeah, but then you, like I say, like in, you know, you're rooting in a way for Michael Myers, and you're rooting for Freddy Krueger, because they become these funny characters that, you know, that his victims in both cases are often just fodder, you know, like, go on, get him. You don't really go, oh no, she got stabbed through the neck. You're like, right, next. And it's a bit like that at this point with these, you know, I don't care about these characters. I don't really care about any of them.
Next time
is going to be, remind me again, you've mentioned it already.
Directed by Peter Sasdy.
Ripper. Okay, now who's in that one?
No idea.
Well, if you're that keen, go on IMDb and figure it out yourself. But we'll be back. Hopefully not as long next time. It's usually Marcus and I having to find a couple of hours to watch the film and a couple of hours to chat. And so it's been an average of every 6 to 8 weeks. Yeah, but we are getting through them, and it will be a shame when we finish. But again, as we said, we'll probably